Welcome to One Step Past. I'm Bucky Wild, and this is
Action Heroes of History, Paul Charles.
Paul Charles isn't a name you'll find in history books, but he is a true legend in the world of aviation. One half of the famous Flying Charles brothers, Paul was born in 1905 to a large family. Of the Charles family's 8 children, only 2 caught the aviation bug, James Shelley and Paul. James Shelley, who was usually just called Shelley, was Paul's older brother. He went through a lot of pilot training and became a master. In the early 1920s, James established a flying service. Charles Field was in Winston-Salem and became a popular hangout for spectators on the weekends. The kind of flying that went on here really pushed the limits of what a pilot could do. Many aviation buffs still believe that this was the time period when pilots were really pilots. You had to know how to handle an airplane to get the most out of it and live to tell the tale. Shelley hired his younger brother Paul as a mechanic for the aviation business. No one could have guessed that Paul would become the hotshot pilot that he did. Paul quickly advanced from mechanic to pilot under Shelley's training, and in 1924 became one of the nation's youngest pilots when he first soloed at age 19. For many years, beginning in 1928, Paul Charles was the youngest licensed commercial pilot, stunt flyer, and wing walker. One of the fascinating aspects about Paul Charles is that he was just as incredible of a mechanic as he was a pilot. He built his first airplane in 1929 and could make nearly anything from junkyard parts. Some of these items include a telescope, cameras, even an automobile. Charles Field moved to Richmond, Virginia in 1927. Shortly after that, Paul left to become the chief pilot and instructor at Gettysburg Flying Service in Pennsylvania. It was during this time when one of the most fantastic Paul Charles stories took place. It was Saturday, June 2nd, 1928. Paul and C.C. Mahler, his student pilot, were flying to Thurmont, Maryland. Their mission was to drop flags over the cemetery during a memorial service for Confederate veterans. It was early in the flight that Paul knew all was not well with the plane. In fact, the landing gear was flapping against the fuselage. Paul turned the controls over to Mahler and walked out on the wing to examine the problem. He got back in the plane, dropped the flags over the cemetery, then flew over the airport and dropped a note asking for help. Another airplane took off and brought Paul some rope and wire. The pilot of that plane was Captain J.H. McKinney, who had with him James Mittinger, a son of the airport manager. McKinney had to be a good pilot himself. The landing gear of his plane, at times, came within less than 2 feet of the top wings of Paul's plane. The transfer of the rope and wire did not go smoothly. There were 35-mile-per-hour winds. The 50 feet of rope got caught in the rudder of Paul's plane. Paul had to be clever to free the rope from his rudder, and it took several attempts to get it in the plane. If that wasn't a tough enough job, what came next would raise anyone's stress level. Paul once again had Mahler take over the controls before walking onto the wing. He hung by his knees, upside down, for 45 minutes as he tied the landing gear into place. Paul then got back into the airplane and landed it safely. I think that Paul's student got his money's worth for that day's lesson. And all the going in and out of the plane and hanging upside down. Was this guy Spider-Man? Shelley became a commercial pilot in 1930 for Pitcairn Airlines, the predecessor to Eastern Airlines. The very next year, Paul had also become a pilot at Eastern Airlines. He also instructed other pilots and retired in 1965. It was in the 1930s that Paul had some other noteworthy adventures. While in Gettysburg, he adopted a pheasant for a mascot. He trained the bird to meet his plane when it landed. This same pheasant would also run after his ship and fly with him for a ways when his plane took off. During the same decade, he had another fantastic in-flight experience. On his way to Newark, New Jersey, Paul noticed oil spewing from one of the engines on his plane. He couldn't land the plane because he was flying over swamps. Paul had his co-pilot take over. A stewardess helped push Paul out of a small window so he could get out on the engine. Once he was out there, Paul simply shut off the petcock valve to stop the oil from flowing. Paul got back in the plane through the small window, with the passengers none the wiser. James Shelley Charles passed away from a long-term heart condition in 1959. Paul outlived his brother by many years before passing away in 1994. In the early days of aviation, it was men like the Charles brothers who pushed the limits, raising the bar for all pilots to follow. Paul's many abilities as a pilot, mechanic, daredevil, even animal trainer, make him a true action hero of history. Thank you for watching. If you like what you see, subscribe and leave me some comments.